On the 16th of December 1944, at 0530 hours, Colonel Oscar Axelson stood in the fire direction center of the 406th Field Artillery Group near Monschau, Germany. He was listening to frantic radio calls from the 38th Cavalry Squadron, who were being overwhelmed by German infantry. The cavalry needed immediate artillery support, or they would be wiped out. Axelson had a solution ready. Crates of new artillery shells marked with red bands, codenamed POSIT, which contained a revolutionary fuse. This fuse could detonate mid-air above enemy troops, turning near misses into effective hits. However, there was a huge issue. These fuses were classified at the highest level, just like the atomic bomb, and were only authorized for certain uses. If Axelson used them without approval, he could face a court-martial. Despite this, he made a snap decision. The cavalry squadron was in immediate danger, and regulations could wait. He ordered his crews to load the proximity-fused shells and fire. Minutes later, the first POSIT rounds screamed over German positions and detonated 30 feet above the ground. The German infantry, advancing on the 38th Cavalry Squadron, were suddenly caught in a barrage of steel shrapnel from above. The attack stalled almost instantly. What Axelson didn't know was that he had just fired the first land-based proximity-fused artillery shells in Europe. The Germans, facing this new weapon, were unaware that they were up against a technology that their best scientists had thought impossible to create. This is the story of how American physicists developed a miniature radar system that could survive being fired from a cannon, kept the technology secret for years, and used it to kill 702 Germans in one artillery barrage, altering warfare forever. The problem with artillery fuses began at Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941, when Japanese aircraft attacked the naval base. American anti-aircraft guns fired thousands of shells with timed fuses, designed to detonate at specific altitudes. The idea was to create a wall of shrapnel for enemy planes to fly through. However, the system relied on gunners' ability to estimate altitude, speed, and time of flight, which rarely worked as intended. Of the 48 civilians killed at Pearl Harbor, many died from misfired shells that exploded on the ground instead of in the air. The statistics were grim. In some cases, gunners fired thousands of shells for every enemy aircraft destroyed. The U.S. Navy recognized they had a serious problem. Aircraft were too fast, too maneuverable, and too high for timed fuses to work accurately. They needed a fuse that would automatically detonate when a shell got close to a target. A proximity fuse. While the concept wasn't new, every attempt at creating such a fuse had failed. The engineering challenges seemed insurmountable. For the fuse to work, it had to sense a nearby target and trigger automatically. This meant placing an electronic sensor inside the shell's nose. But artillery shells undergo extreme forces that would destroy any conventional electronics. When fired from a naval gun, an artillery shell accelerates to 2,800 feet per second, subjecting it to a setback force of 20,000 times gravity and a spin of 25,000 revolutions per minute. These forces would instantly destroy any fragile electronics. The fuse also needed to be small, reliable, weatherproof, and cheap to manufacture. It had to work in all conditions: rain, fog, night, extreme heat, and cold, and be simple enough for sailors to handle without special training. German scientists had been working on proximity fuses since the early 1930s. By 1944, they had explored over 30 different designs, including systems that used sound, electrostatic fields, and radio frequency to detect targets. But none of these designs worked well enough. In 1943, German engineers concluded that creating a vacuum tube-based radio fuse for artillery was impossible. The problem could not be solved. In Britain, scientists had made some progress. Starting in 1939, researchers at PI Limited began developing proximity fuses for rockets, which had gentler acceleration compared to artillery shells. However, adapting this technology for high-velocity artillery failed repeatedly. The fuses shattered, and the circuits malfunctioned. In 1940, a British mission led by Henry Tizard brought their most secret technologies to the US, including their proximity fuse designs. The Americans took over the project and began working to solve the engineering problems. Dr. Merle Tuve a physicist who had helped develop radar, was put in charge. He understood the challenge wasn't the idea itself, but the execution. The team worked quickly, and in a few months, they made breakthroughs. One key development was a system that used separate transmitter and receiver circuits, rather than a combined transceiver. But the vacuum tube problem remained. Regular vacuum tubes shattered under the forces of gunfire. Engineers turned to miniature vacuum tubes used in hearing aids. These tubes were small, sturdy, and used little power, making them ideal for the proximity fuse. Engineers worked with Western Electric and Raytheon to modify the tubes to survive artillery firing. After months of testing, they developed tubes that could withstand the extreme forces. By January 1942, the engineers had perfected the design. Each proximity fuse contained 5 miniature vacuum tubes, resistors, capacitors, a battery, a safety mechanism, and a detonator. The fuse had to be small enough to fit in a standard artillery shell, but tough enough to survive the shock of being fired. The battery system was another challenge. Standard batteries wouldn't survive the shock of firing, so engineers developed a special reserve battery activated by the force of the shot. Safety mechanisms were added to prevent premature detonation, including a system that kept the fuse inert until the shell had traveled far enough to protect friendly forces. In just a few years, American engineers turned a seemingly impossible idea into reality, creating a proximity fuse that could change the course of the war. In early August 1942, the Navy conducted the first live fire test of proximity-fused shells in Chesapeake Bay. During the test, the cruiser USS Cleveland fired at radio-controlled drone aircraft on August 12th as part of its shakedown cruise. The test was scheduled for 2 days, but it ended after just 1 day because all the drones were destroyed. The gun crews aboard the Cleveland fired 4 shells, and 3 of the drones were taken out. Navy observers were astonished by the results. For the first time in history, anti-aircraft gunners were able to reliably hit moving aerial targets without direct hits. The shells only needed to pass within 70 feet of the target, and the proximity fuse would detonate automatically, filling the target with lethal shrapnel. The results were so impressive that some Navy officers initially suspected the test had been rigged or that the results were somehow misleading. However, further tests confirmed that the proximity fuses worked flawlessly, representing a major breakthrough in anti-aircraft warfare. But while the test results were promising, turning the technology into a mass production weapon was a different challenge. By January 1943, the team working on proximity fuses had expanded, and the project was moved from the Carnegie Institution to Johns Hopkins University's Applied Physics Laboratory. The effort grew significantly, involving 26 contractors and 10,000 workers. More than 100 American companies, including General Electric, RCA, and Sylvania, contributed to the production of the fuses. Each fuse contained 130 miniaturized electronic components, and the assembly required precise craftsmanship. The workers, however, were kept in the dark about what they were actually building, with absolute security in place. At its peak, American factories were producing over 100,000 proximity fuses per week. The cost of each fuse dropped dramatically, from $732 in early 1942 to just $18 by 1945, thanks to improved manufacturing techniques and economies of scale. In November 1942, the Navy sent 5,000 proximity fuses to Pearl Harbor. However, their use was initially restricted to areas over the ocean, where dud shells would safely sink. If a fuse failed and fell on land, there was a risk that the enemy might recover it and reverse engineer the technology, which the Pentagon wanted to avoid. In January 1943, the fuses were tested in combat when the USS Helena, a light cruiser, fired proximity-fused shells at Japanese dive bombers off Cape Hunter, Guadalcanal. Despite having minimal time to aim, the shells exploded in the air near the dive bombers, destroying them. This was the first confirmed kill of an enemy aircraft using a proximity-fused shell in combat. Over the next 12 months, the effectiveness of the proximity fuses became undeniable. In 1943, Navy ships fired 9,128 proximity-fused rounds and destroyed 61 enemy aircraft, 1 kill for every 155 shells fired, compared to 508 rounds per kill with time-fused shells. As more experience was gained and fire control systems improved, the kill ratio improved even further. By 1944, more than 32,000 proximity-fused rounds were fired, leading to the destruction of hundreds of enemy aircraft. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the proximity fuses were vital in defending U.S. carriers from Japanese attacks. However, while the Navy was using proximity fuses extensively in the Pacific, the Army was still prohibited from using them in Europe. The restriction remained in place through 1943 and most of 1944. The Pentagon feared that even one dud shell falling into German hands could compromise Allied air superiority. But when Germany began launching V-1 cruise missiles at London in June 1944, the Pentagon changed its stance and allowed limited use of proximity fuses to defend the city. The results were immediate. In the first week, British anti-aircraft guns using proximity fuses destroyed 17% of incoming V-1s, a significant improvement over traditional methods. As experience with the fuses grew, the success rate climbed to 79% by the fourth week, and by late August, it reached 74% of all incoming V-1s. The use of proximity fuses saved London from a devastating missile attack. As the V-1 threat shifted to Antwerp, the restrictions on proximity fuse use over land were further relaxed. In late 1944, proximity fuses played a key role in defending the port of Antwerp, which was crucial for the Allied advance into Germany. The fuses proved highly effective, with anti-aircraft units destroying more than 2,000 V-1s targeting Antwerp and London combined. By October 1944, the combined Chiefs of Staff authorized the general use of proximity fuses for anti-aircraft defense over land in Europe, marking the beginning of their widespread deployment across the continent. However, Army artillery officers were frustrated that proximity fuses were still not allowed for use against ground targets. They knew the fuses would be devastatingly effective in that role as well. A conventional artillery shell detonated on impact with the ground, meaning that troops in trenches, foxholes, or behind cover were generally safe. But a proximity fuse that detonated in the air above them would shower shrapnel down into their positions, turning safe places into death traps. Trenches were no longer safe. Foxholes offered no protection. Even log-reinforced bunkers could be penetrated by high-velocity fragments. Proximity-fused artillery significantly increased the lethality of American firepower. However, the Pentagon still held firm on restrictions. The risk of a dud shell falling into German hands was considered too high. Army artillery would have to wait. Then, on the 16th of December 1944, Germany launched Operation Watch on the Rhine. 3 German armies attacked through the Ardennes forest in Belgium and Luxembourg, surprising thinly held American positions with overwhelming force. German armor broke through American lines and advanced toward the Meuse River and the Belgian port of Antwerp. The Battle of the Bulge had begun, and American forces were in serious trouble. Colonel Oscar Axelson, leading the 406th Field Artillery Group, decided to use proximity fuses as soon as the attack began. His unit had recently received shipments of Posset shells proximity-fused artillery rounds. When the 38th Cavalry Squadron called for fire support, Axelson knew that conventional shells would have limited effect on the German infantry advancing through forested terrain. But proximity-fused shells detonating above the trees would kill anything in the open. He ordered his gunners to load the Posset shells and fire. The effect was immediate and devastating. German infantry caught in the barrage were mowed down by airbursts they never saw coming. The attack on the 38th Cavalry Squadron collapsed. 3 days later, on December 19, General Dwight Eisenhower formally requested authorization to use proximity-fused artillery shells across the entire European theater. The German offensive was the largest attack the U.S. Army had ever faced. Every advantage mattered. On December 21, all restrictions were lifted, and proximity-fused artillery shells were released for general use. The timing was critical. On December 23, American artillery units supporting the town of Malmedy fired proximity fuses with devastating effect. German soldiers trying to advance found themselves caught in airbursts that exploded overhead with no warning. Some Germans, desperate to surrender, ran toward the artillery fire, hands raised, shouting "Kamerad," the German word for comrade. By December 23, estimates suggested that as many as 2,000 German soldiers had been killed by proximity-fused artillery shells in just the first few days. The Germans quickly realized they were facing a new type of weapon. Prisoners of war reported the demoralizing effect of artillery shells that exploded above them with perfect timing. Traditional artillery gave soldiers a brief moment of hope. They would hear the whistle of incoming shells and dive for cover, hoping that if they were in a trench or foxhole, they might survive even a direct hit. But proximity-fused shells detonated 30 to 50 feet above the ground, directly above defensive positions. There was no cover, no warning. The shells arrived silently and detonated overhead, raining shrapnel down. Soldiers who thought they were safe in prepared positions were killed without ever seeing the threat. The psychological impact was severe. German commanders offered rewards for anyone who could recover an intact proximity fuse to figure out how it worked and develop countermeasures. In late December 1944, German forces captured an American ammunition dump containing 20,000 proximity-fused artillery shells. German engineers carefully examined the fuses and recognized that sophisticated electronics were involved, but they couldn't understand how the technology worked. They assumed the fuses were defective or designed for a different purpose, as their own research had convinced them that miniature vacuum tubes couldn't survive the forces of artillery firing. They never realized what they were looking at. By the time the Germans figured out the significance of the proximity fuses, the war was almost over, and they had no industrial capacity left to develop countermeasures. On December 25 and 26, 1944, General George Patton's Third Army caught a German battalion attempting to cross the Sauer River near Ettelbruck, Luxembourg. American artillery fired a concentrated barrage using proximity-fused shells, detonating above the river and the German troops on the banks. The soldiers had no cover, no place to hide. They were completely exposed. Patton later wrote about the result. "The new shell with the funny fuse is devastating. We caught a German battalion trying to cross the Sauer River with a concentration of battalion and killed by actual count 702. A confirmed 702 German soldiers were killed in a single artillery barrage, unprecedented. Number 3. Armor Scott, a liver time and armor sly. Lethality. Conventional artillery shells might have killed 50 or 60 soldiers under similar circumstances, but proximity fuses made the artillery 10 times more effective. This wasn't an isolated incident. Throughout the Battle of the Bulge, proximity-fused artillery wreaked havoc on German forces caught in the open. In the Hurtgen Forest, an American officer reported finding 96 bodies of a German patrol hit by a massed proximity-fused barrage. The bodies looked as though they had been shredded. The impact of proximity fuses was so severe that German soldiers began refusing orders to move forward when they knew American artillery was in position. They had learned to take cover from traditional artillery, but proximity-fused shells didn't require accurate observation. They automatically detonated at the optimal height above the ground, regardless of weather or visibility. American gunners only needed to know the approximate location of the German forces, and the proximity fuses did the rest. The bad weather that had previously protected the Germans was now meaningless. By late January 1945, German resistance in the Ardennes had collapsed. The Battle of the Bulge was over. Proximity-fused artillery had played a critical role in the victory. Patton later stated, "The funny fuse won the Battle of the Bulge for us." While that might have been an exaggeration, the proximity fuse undeniably changed the tactical situation. German forces that could have defended prepared positions effectively against conventional artillery were destroyed by air bursts they couldn't avoid. In the Pacific, the proximity fuse had an even greater impact. By 1945, the Japanese had adopted kamikaze tactics, using suicide aircraft to attack American ships. These attacks were incredibly difficult to defend against, as conventional anti-aircraft fire required direct hits. Kamikaze pilots often flew at wave-top altitudes, making detection difficult, and would pull up sharply before diving into ships. Proximity-fused shells created a defensive barrier around ships that was nearly impossible for kamikaze aircraft to penetrate. They didn't need to hit the aircraft directly, Just passing nearby was enough to destroy it. Ships armed with proximity fuses were 5 to 10 times more effective at stopping kamikaze attacks than those using conventional shells. Admiral Arleigh Burke, who commanded destroyers during the Solomon Islands campaign, later wrote about how conventional time-fused shells only brought down a plane at night by accident. The proximity fuse changed everything, making nighttime air defense effective for the first time. From January to July 1945, American ships used nearly two-thirds of all the proximity fuses fired during the war, shooting down more than 200 aircraft. The proximity fuse allowed the Navy to maintain operations in areas where kamikaze attacks would otherwise have made naval operations too dangerous. The proximity fuse's impact went beyond just numbers. The psychological effect on enemy forces was significant. Japanese pilots knew that approaching American ships, equipped with proximity-fused anti-aircraft guns, meant flying into an invisible sphere of death. They couldn't avoid it. Some historians have suggested that the proximity fuse was one reason Japan turned to kamikaze tactics when conventional attacks couldn't penetrate American defenses. Suicide attacks seemed like the only option. The proximity fuse followed a pattern that was repeated throughout World War II and beyond. Technological advantage in warfare doesn't just come from groundbreaking theories, it's about execution, engineering, and manufacturing on a massive scale. The concept of the proximity fuse was understood by several nations before the war even began. What set the successful development of the fuse apart from failure was the ability to tackle thousands of small engineering problems, manufacture precise components, and produce complex electronic devices in vast quantities while maintaining quality control. The United States had the industrial capacity, skilled workforce, and organizational structure to coordinate work across numerous contractors, while Germany and Japan did not. By 1944, American industry was producing more proximity fuses every month than Germany and Japan combined had produced artillery shells of all types. General George Patton was right when he said that armies would need to develop new methods of warfare. Once proximity fused, artillery became widespread. The idea that soldiers in trenches or foxholes were safe from artillery had been a fundamental part of military tactics since World War I. But the proximity fuse shattered that belief. Defensive positions that had once been considered safe were now death traps. Armies would need to disperse, build deeper fortifications, and move faster to avoid artillery barrages. The tactical shifts caused by proximity-fused artillery would affect military doctrine for decades. Section T operated on a timeline that would have seemed impossible in peacetime. From the initial assignment in August 1940 to the first combat use in January 1943 was less than 2.5 years. During that time, Dr. Merle Tuve's team solved problems that had baffled scientists for over a decade. They developed miniature, ruggedized vacuum tubes that could withstand forces no civilian electronics had ever encountered. They designed circuits that operated reliably under extreme conditions, vibrations, temperature fluctuations, and electromagnetic interference. They created manufacturing processes that could produce these devices in large quantities, all while maintaining strict secrecy to prevent enemy to intelligence from learning what they were building. Dr. Tuve never received public recognition for his leadership of the Proximity Fuse project during the war. The project remained classified until after Japan's surrender. Even after the war, Tuve was reluctant to discuss his role. He understood that Section T's success had saved thousands of Allied lives, but he also knew that many people across various organizations had contributed to that success. The proximity fuse wasn't the work of a single genius. It was the result of systematic collaboration between physicists, engineers, manufacturers, and military personnel from dozens of organizations. Over 22 million proximity fuses were produced during World War II by more than 100 manufacturers, requiring contributions from thousands of people, many of whom never knew what they were building. After the war, Tuve returned to the Department of Terrestrial Magnetism at the Carnegie Institution, where he served as director from 1946 to 1966. He continued research in geophysics and radio astronomy. In 1948, he was honored with an honorary Commander of the Order of the British Empire for his service during the war. President Harry Truman awarded him the Presidential Medal for Merit, but Tuve rarely spoke about the proximity fuse. When asked about his wartime work, He emphasized the collaborative nature of the project and the contributions of the engineers and technicians who had solved countless technical problems. Tuve died on the 20th of May, 1982, at the age of 80. His obituaries mentioned his contributions to geophysics and his leadership of the Applied Physics Laboratory during World War II. But most didn't detail his work on the proximity fuse. Although the technology had been declassified for decades, it remained obscure outside military and technical circles. Tuve never sought fame for his wartime work. He believed scientific achievements should be measured by results, not recognition. The proximity fuse saved lives and helped win the war that was what mattered. The Applied Physics Laboratory that Tuve founded still operates today as part of Johns Hopkins University. It conducts research in national security, space exploration, and advanced technology development. The building where Section T first assembled proximity fuses in 1942 was demolished long ago and replaced by commercial development. There is no marker to commemorate it as the birthplace of one of the war's most important technologies. The workers who assembled the fuses in factories across America returned to their civilian jobs after the war. Most of them never learned exactly what they had been making. The soldiers and sailors who benefited from proximity fused ammunition rarely knew how it worked, only that anti-aircraft guns were suddenly much more effective and artillery barrages were far more lethal. The technology remained a mystery even to those whose lives it saved. The 702 German soldiers killed by proximity fused artillery on the banks of the Sauer River in December 1944 were buried in military cemeteries in Luxembourg and Germany. Their graves don't mention how they died. The military records list them as killed in action by artillery fire, which was true but incomplete. They were among the first ground troops to be killed by a technology their own scientists had declared impossible to build. They died without knowing that the shells exploding above them contained miniature radar sets more advanced than anything Germany had been able to create. They didn't know that American factories were mass-producing these shells, while German industry struggled to manufacture basic artillery ammunition. German engineers who had declared proximity fuses impossible never understood what they had missed. After the war, American intelligence teams showed captured German scientists their documents on proximity fuse research. The Germans had explored similar technical approaches, including radio frequency, fuses, vacuum tube designs, and miniaturization techniques. But they had concluded that the engineering challenges couldn't be overcome with existing technology. What set the American project apart wasn't scientific knowledge, it was engineering persistence and manufacturing capability. American industry could produce ruggedized miniature vacuum tubes in millions of units. American engineers could go through dozens of design failures to find solutions that worked. Germany lacked the industrial base and time to compete on these terms. British scientists who had contributed to the initial circuit designs for the proximity fuse watched American success with mixed feelings. While they had solved many of the conceptual problems, they couldn't scale their work to mass production. The British proximity fuse program produced working prototypes, but never achieved the reliability and cost-effectiveness needed for widespread military use. When the Tizard mission brought British proximity fuse designs to the U.S. in August 1940, they gave the Americans a starting point. But, as Tuve later noted, the circuit design that worked in the U.S. was substantially different from the British one. American engineers redesigned nearly every aspect of the fuse to meet Navy specifications and survive the brutal forces of artillery firing. This is how wars are won not through individual genius, but through collaboration among scientists, engineers, manufacturers, and military personnel. The proximity fuse succeeded because Section T could tap into the resources of American industry, the technical expertise of academic researchers, and the practical knowledge of Navy ordnance officers. It succeeded because companies like Western Electric and Rathon could manufacture ruggedized vacuum tubes that no one had made before. It succeeded because factory workers could assemble complex electronics on a scale no other nation could match. And it succeeded because Colonel Oscar Axelson made the decision to use the technology when it mattered most, even though it went against direct orders. The story of the proximity fuse is the story of American industrial and scientific power at its peak of innovation that didn't come from individual brilliance, but from systematic problem-solving on a massive scale. It's a story of a technology that saved thousands of Allied lives and changed warfare forever. Developed by people whose names are mostly forgotten today.